What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I'm going to be bringing you part 2 of my Middle-earth review series, where I'm going to be reviewing every single Middle-earth film. Now, that is the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogies. Today, I'm going to be talking about The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, a film that many people love, including myself. It's one of my favorite movies, and that a lot of people consider to be the best of the Hobbit trilogy, and I would have to agree with that. Now, before I get into it, I do want to clarify that I am only reviewing the theatrical releases. When I get to The Lord of the Rings, I will be talking about the extended editions, because I do have those. I don't have the Hobbit extended editions, and I haven't seen them all the way through. I do know some of the scenes and additions that are within those cuts, but I haven't seen them all the way through, and I've never been able to find them, so for the Hobbit trilogy, I am only talking about the theatrical releases. I wanted to clear that up because I didn't really explain that in the first review. Now, before we get into, all the great stuff, because there's a lot of it in this film, I do want to talk about kind of some negative things that aren't super great. The film feels like it's very fast-paced for the first half, which isn't a problem, but it does mean that elements in the book that were given a little more time to breathe are a little bit rushed. Like, for example, Beorn, the skin changer that they introduce at the beginning of the film. That element feels a little bit more rushed than in the book. In the book, it's a relatively lengthy chapter where they do bother to explain more about him and his past, and basically in this film, it just boils down to a very brief exposition scene where he explains his past and how his people were enslaved by Azog and the orcs, and how his species is basically extinct with an exception of him, and then briefly just says, I don't like dwarves, but I like orcs more, so therefore I will help you. In the book, they gave it more time. They stayed with him for a couple days, and he grew to know them and like them, and then he trusted them enough to actually help them on their journey. In the film, it feels kind of rushed. They just meet him, and then he just agrees to help them randomly. And it's kind of like, oh, that's a little bit rushed. It feels like there's a little bit of context missing behind, his distaste for dwarves. In the book, they go into that more, but in the film, it's just kind of, I don't like dwarves. They're greedy, but orcs are worse, so I'll help you. It's kind of rushed. It feels kind of rushed, and it's missing some context. And even the opening sequence is a little bit weird, because it doesn't really have any overall significance in terms of the film. I feel like it was included to give people a recap if they hadn't seen the first film, so it's basically just Thorin meeting Gandalf in the Prancing Pony, which is a location from The Lord of the Rings, so I guess they wanted to shoot there again as kind of a nod to, oh hey, here's this scene, or this location that we shot scenes in from The Lord of the Rings. But basically it's just Gandalf meeting with Thorin before they meet with Bilbo, and they're arranging for the adventure. And it's fine, but it's kind of, cheesy, when Thorin walks in and there's all these guys looking angrily at him and the music's all dramatic, and then Gandalf walks in and they all back off because Gandalf's, the best. And then there's kind of this weird moment when Gandalf gives Thorin this piece of paper and says that someone has kind of declared a price for Thorin's head and that someone wants him dead. And that doesn't really make sense in the context of the first film, because when they were being hunted in the first film and the first warg attacked them, after the troll sequence, they seem surprised. Gandalf asks him, who else did you tell about your quest? And Thorin's like, no one, I swear. And it feels weird that they add this bit in where they knew Thorin was being hunted and someone wanted him dead. So it doesn't make sense why they were acting surprised in that scene in the first movie. It's kind of weird. It kind of creates a bit of a plot hole. That scene wasn't in the book, and like I said, it feels kind of mostly like a recap for okay, here's what the plot is. They want to go reclaim their homeland from the dragon, and then they go 12 months later, and then it's current day after the events of the first film. And it feels kind of weird. That whole sequence is kind of cheesy. It's not really necessary. It's kind of fun, but it doesn't really add any different context. I know that in the extended editions, they add in this element with Thorin's father and how he was actually alive, and then that comes into play later when Gandalf goes to Dol Guldur, and it's revealed that Thorin's father has been there and he's gone insane. But in the context of the theatrical version, it doesn't add any context to the story that wasn't there originally, and feels mostly like it's meant for a recap of those who maybe missed the first film, which I find kind of weird. But there you go. That opening scene is just a little bit weird, and there's some silly moments and weird things. Something that kind of sticks out to me that not a lot of people talk about is the fact that the swords glowing blue, like Bilbo, Gandalf, and Thorin's swords are the elven swords that are enchanted to glow blue when orcs or goblins are nearby. And they really went out of their way to make the sword Sting in the first film glow really bright blue. But then as the films go on, it's super inconsistent. Like, Thorin's sword glows blue at one point in the first movie and then never does again for the entire series. Legolas takes it. Legolas fights a bunch of orcs. It's not glowing blue. Bilbo's glows blue sometimes and then doesn't at other points. There's just a bunch of inconsistencies there. And then, like, it's just kind of more pale blue. It's more like the Lord of the Rings, where whenever it glows blue, it's like a pale blue color. It feels like they put a lot of budget into making it glow really bright in the first film and then kind of abandoned that, which is kind of lame because I really loved how bright and vibrant it was in the first Hobbit film, and they kind of muted the colors on it. That's just kind of a minor thing that probably doesn't matter to a lot of people. There are also some minor things that I kind of prefer in the book. Like, for example, in the spider sequence when they go into Mirkwood, in the book, Bilbo kills the first spider, and he comes up with the name for the sword on his own. He kills it and then says, "Sting. I'm going to call you Sting." In the film, however, it's a little bit cheesier, and I don't like it as much. Bilbo stabs the spider similar to the book, but then it goes, "It stings! Stings!" And then it dies. And then Bilbo comes up with the name for the sword basically from the spider. Like, the spider basically named the sword for him rather than him coming up with it by himself, like in the book. I kind of prefer that element in the book, Something else is that Gandalf basically gets his ass kicked, like, way too much. It's something that not a lot of people bring up because a lot of people love Gandalf, and they're like, "Gandalf's a badass, hell yeah, man," but he kind of gets his ass beaten a lot, and it's like, there's this plot element that they introduce in these films that wasn't in the book, where Gandalf goes to investigate Dol Guldur and the potential resurgence of Sauron. And it's interesting, and I like the way it ties into the Lord of the Rings, and I don't mind it at all. But what's weird is there's this scene when Radagast comes up, and he's like, "Gandalf, what if it's a trap?" And he's about to walk in, and then Gandalf's like, "Turn around, it is undoubtedly a trap." And then he walks in, immediately gets beaten up by Azog, and then gets his ass kicked by Sauron, and immediately gets captured, and then has to get rescued by the rest of the White Council in the Battle of the Five Armies. It feels really weird how he just, like, goes in with no plan. Like, you'd expect Gandalf to be like, "Alright, I've got some strategy here." But he basically just tells Radagast, "Go get the other guys to come help me, because I'm probably going to get my ass kicked." And then he immediately gets his ass kicked. Like, he has no plan. He just runs in and gets beaten up by a bunch of orcs, and then gets beaten up by Sauron. It's like, okay, what is with this? Why did you do that, Gandalf? And it just happens way too often, I feel. Like, in every movie, he gets beaten up all the time. Like, it's like, wow, Gandalf, I really believe that you're this powerful. Like, that didn't happen as much in the book. In the book, Gandalf basically left the story for the sake of it because Tolkien wanted the Hobbit and the dwarves to kind of figure their way out of these sticky situations without the wizard being there to help them. So he just wrote him out of the story saying he had some important business to attend to. And in the films, they add this subplot where he has to go to Dol Guldur and deal with Sauron. And I don't mind it, but it kind of feels stupid that he just went in with no plan and then immediately got his ass kicked. It's just kind of like, all right. And then lastly, the cliffhanger at the end of this film is an odd decision. I don't mind it. I remember seeing it in theaters and being like, wow, what a cliffhanger. Basically, Smaug leaves the mountain, starts flying towards Lake Town, and says, "I am fire. I am death." And then Bilbo goes, "What have we done?" And it dramatically cuts to black. It's a pretty good cliffhanger, all things considered. But when we get to the third film, it's really dragged out. It's kind of by most people considered to be the shortest part of the book and the least memorable. And they dragged it out a lot. But we're going to talk about that when we get to it. So it's like, in the context of this film, the cliffhanger works well, but going into the third one, it kind of loses some of its power, loses some of its punch because of how weak the third film is. But we'll get back to that when we get to that film. Now I'm going to praise this film to the heavens because I love it. All right. So there are a lot of elements that actually make more sense than in the book. One example is the spiders in Mirkwood. In the book, the spiders in Mirkwood are just explained to be there. They're just there because it's a fantasy story. But in the film, they actually write in that it's because of Sauron's dark magic that they have grown to this abnormal size and that they're kind of they just keep spawning and going into the forest. So I don't mind that. I actually think that's kind of a cool explanation for something that was kind of written off as, oh, it's just fantasy in the book. Thorin and Thranduil, the Elven kings, Legolas's father, their feud makes more sense in the context of the films because Thorin called on him for aid when Smaug invaded, but he turned his back on them, so he feels betrayed by them, and that's why Thorin has this distaste for elves in the films, which was not present in the book. In the book, there's nothing like that. It's basically briefly alluded to that Thranduil had some kind of past with dwarves, but it wasn't Thorin's family or anything. It was completely unrelated to Thorin, and he just doesn't like dwarves for some reason. And he locks Thorin up for no reason in the book. But in this film, you get a vibe of how far back their kind of dynamic goes and that they actually have history, and Thorin has distaste for him for his betrayal of them that he feels he committed. So there's actually more depth to that, and it makes more sense in the book why he kind of locks Thorin away and why they have this feud. I think it's better done here, and I feel like there's a lot more to the Thranduil character in these films than in the book, because he's kind of this stoic, hardened character who seems dispassionate towards anyone else besides his own people, but you realize that it's because of his past and these traumatic experiences he's gone through, and he just wants to do what he feels is best for his people and doesn't really think about the larger picture. They gave him a lot of depth in these films that I feel was not present in the book, and I have to give them credit for that. Lee Pace does a really good job as Thranduil. And, you know, they actually added a little bit more to the dwarves' arrival in Lake Town, and it kind of makes more sense. They actually have to get smuggled into Lake Town by Bard, and they hide in these barrels full of fish. That wasn't in the book. In the book, they escape from the Elven Kingdom and just kind of stroll into Lake Town and are immediately accepted by the town. But in the movie, they actually add in this whole element where they're smuggled in and the master is spying on Bard because they're suspicious of Bard, and Bard's role is really beefed up in the films as compared to the book, which I don't mind at all because I think Luke Evans is really good as the character, and I think they added a lot to him that wasn't in the book. But, you know, it makes a lot more sense why people are suspicious of them, and that there would be kind of more of a threat there. You know, there'd be more of a process to get them into Lake Town rather than just strolling in and immediately being accepted by everyone. There's more of a slow unraveling of the dwarves and their purpose in Lake Town in the film, which I feel actually works. And in the book, it's fine, but I feel like the film benefits from kind of adding more of a slowly unspooling thread there than in the book, if that makes sense. I feel like it adds to the cinematicness, I guess, of the film. So I like that element quite a bit. Also, there are a lot of changes. This film is where a lot of the changes really start to come in from the book. You know, the first film stuck pretty close to the book, just with some additions and kind of set up threads that were continued in the later films, but here there's so many changes. Characters exist that didn't exist in the book, and they add characters that were in The Lord of the Rings that weren't in the Hobbit book. For example, Legolas, a character that Tolkien had not written until The Lord of the Rings, but did write in The Lord of the Rings that he is the son of Thranduil from the Hobbit book. In the Hobbit book, Thranduil doesn't have a name, he's just the Elven king. But still, he wrote that later on. So why would Legolas realistically not be around at this point in time? It would make less sense if he wasn't around, so they add him in, and I think he has a fine role. He shows up at a couple points in the film. He's a badass as per usual, And he's not the most deep character, but it's cool to set him up and his dynamic with dwarves. I feel like it adds an extra layer to him going into The Lord of the Rings through his kind of feud with Thorin and this weird kind of debt that they feel they owe each other because Thorin saves him in this film, and that going to the third film makes Legolas feel obliged to help Thorin. I don't know, it's just a cool dynamic and adds to his distrustingness of dwarves and his willingness to trust Gimli and their relationship in The Lord of the Rings. I don't know, I just really like that. I think that adding him in was a welcome addition, and I think they did a good job tying him into the narrative. Tauriel is a character they completely made up for the film. Now, if you didn't know, this is just kind of a side effect of the sexism of the time when Tolkien was writing, but there are no women in the Hobbit book. Once again, just a result of sexism at the time. But the only women that exist in the book were referenced briefly and are alluded to, but none of them have a large role. So they beefed up Galadriel's role in the film to actually being one of the main cast and not being in it at all, like in the book. She doesn't exist in the book. She wasn't written until Lord of the Rings. So Tauriel is a character they completely made up for The Hobbit or for the films, and I think she's great. I think she's a badass. I think she's a cool character, and I don't mind having her around at all. Evangeline Lilly does a great job. I think she's a cool character, and I personally never minded the kind of romance she has with Kili, the dwarf. I feel like it adds more to a character that wouldn't have a lot to him initially, and I think it works for an allegory for discriminatory relationships. A lot of people are looking down on them for their relationship throughout the films, and I feel like that works great for an allegory for, gay relationships in real life. I think it works fine. I don't have a problem with that relationship. A lot of people kind of complain about that, but it doesn't ruin it for me at all. Like, sure, there are more compelling elements, but it doesn't bother me. I don't really have a problem with that relationship, and I don't have a problem with them introducing that character. I think that, you want to add in a cool female character, there you go. You got Evangeline Lilly, she does a good job. I think she's a perfectly fine character. They also beefed up Bard's role considerably. He has a family, and he has more of a dynamic with the dwarves, and he's kind of distrusting of the dwarves when they arrive in Lake Town. And I really like that. I like that they add in the element that his ancestor was the one who shot down the dragon. I don't believe that's in the book, because Bard does not appear until Smaug attacks Lake Town in the book. And I don't believe they write in this element that his ancestor was the one that formerly failed to shoot down Smaug. So I like that he is kind of rectifying the mistakes of his ancestors, and I like that he is not corrupted by greed, because there's one of the main thematic elements of even the book and of all of these in general. The ring is kind of a theme for addiction, or an allegory for addiction, greed, and all that, and these films heavily deal with themes of greed, and I think they do a really good job with his character and how he is kind of unaffected by greed. Similarly, Bilbo, at least at this point in time, is not affected by greed as well. So he's actually more able in the third film to see the perspectives of others than the dwarves. And I like kind of the thematic element that, he is the one person who is skeptical of the dwarves returning to the mountain, because he, realizes that people are forgetting the element of the prophecy of the King Under the Mountain returning, that the lake would shine and burn. The dragon would attack Lake Town and kill everyone within it. And he's the only one that sees through kind of the facade, right? Thorin is corrupted by greed of retaking his home. The dwarves are just kind of followers of him. And the men of the lake are corrupted by greed because they want to share in the wealth of the mountain, right? They don't value just family. There's kind of that thematic element of family with Bard in the third film. They keep that intact. But he's uncorrupted by greed. But then you have the master of Lake Town, Stephen Fry, and his underling, Alfred, and they're all just corrupted by the greed of wanting the riches to be shared with them within the mountain. And there's even a scene that's cut from the film that amplifies that theme, where when Kili has been poisoned by the arrow from the orcs and they take him to Stephen Fry is like, "No, get out of here!" But when they take him to Bard is the one that takes them in, the person that everyone else looks down upon for having a different view, but who ultimately was right in the end. And I really like that. I like that they beefed up his role. I like that they used him to amplify that theme of greed, and I love those themes of greed that are only kind of amplified even further and are explored further in the third film. So I'll touch more on that then, but I love the themes of greed that are touched on in this film in particular. And I think that they do a lot of fun things with this film. They add elements that work well for it as a blockbuster film. They add in elements of action that were not in the book. For example, the barrel escape scene. In the book, it plays out pretty much the same. Bilbo frees the dwarves, they get in the barrels, they ride down the river. But in the film, they add in this action scene of the orcs attacking them on the river and then having the elves kind of be there as well, Legolas and Tauriel, and fighting the orcs as they're trying to escape. I think it's a fun action scene. It's a really fun scene, and it works well as a blockbuster, because this is a blockbuster film, so they add in those elements of action for people who want that kind of stuff, and I feel like it works well in the film. They're able to turn elements that were in the book not so much like that. They were just kind of brief moments. Like, in the book, basically, they roll down the river unhindered, but I like that they add in this action sequence in the film that's really fun and entertaining to watch. Same thing goes for the scene with Smaug inside the mountain at the end of the film, where the dwarves have to light up the forges to try to melt this gold statue and drown Smaug in gold. I think that whole sequence is really fun, despite being a little bit kind of devoid of tension, because we know all of the characters can't die, so there's a lot of carnage that occurs, and miraculously no one dies or is seriously injured. But that's just because they can't die yet, because they don't die yet in the course of the story. But I think that works perfectly fine. I really like that scene. It adds some fun action to the film as well. And all the stuff in Lake Town with Legolas and the orcs and all that, it's all added in. I don't mind the whole thing with Bolg and Legolas. Although it's kind of weird that they introduced Bolg at all. If you didn't know, Bolg is Azog's son. The main kind of antagonist to Thorin's character is Azog. And in the book, Thorin had killed Azog many years ago, and in the Battle of the Five Armies in the book, Bolg returns to get revenge for the death of his father. But in the film, they just add him in, and he's kind of a henchman dude. Like, he has kind of a cool design. He's got the bolts in his head, kind of stitching his head together, which is kind of funny. But, like, I don't mind his, like, kind of dynamic with Legolas, and how Legolas has kind of this main foe in the films. So I don't mind that at all. I think that's fun. You know, and it still has some of my favorite small moments in the series. You know, the things that I love most, I've already talked about this in films, even if people don't like them, are the small, tender moments of character. And before Bilbo goes into the mountain to try and find the Arkenstone from under Smaug's belly, I guess, you just have this really sweet, tender moment between him and Balin says, "It never ceases to amaze me. The courage of hobbits." You know, it's just, that is just such a wonderful little scene that was not really as present in the book, but that is really memorable in this film. And I love those little tender moments. I think those are great. And, you know, once Bilbo does enter the mountain, oh my god, time for me to gush over Smaug. Some of the best CGI I think ever put to screen. Benedict Cumberbatch was perfect casting. I can't imagine anyone else voicing that character. It's almost word for word verbatim from the book. Their entire interaction is perfect. Martin Freeman's acting is great. Once again, just some of the best special effects I feel ever put to film. They somehow even made the dragon look like Benedict Cumberbatch, which is like the craziest stuff ever. But I love that. I think that whole sequence is great, just them going back and forth. And it's crazy that they're able to make these scenes of just people going back and forth in dialogue some of the most exciting moments in these films. I would argue the most exciting and iconic moments from these films are Bilbo's riddles with Gollum in the first film and Bilbo's interaction with Smaug in the second. Those moments of dialogue are even more engaging than the action scenes. And I think that really speaks to the true quality of these films. And kind of lastly, I'll say that this film doesn't have as many individual moments that I love as the first film. The first film had all those individual moments of tenderness. Bilbo's speech at the end, Bilbo coming to save Thorin, Gandalf's speech to Galadriel and Rivendell, Bofur and Bilbo's conversation, those films just had, or the first film had so many of my favorite individual moments. But that film did have its pacing issues. It moved pretty fast at certain points and then slowed down, and I didn't mind that. I think it works fine because that's kind of the way the book went as well. But I love kind of all the tender, small moments between characters in that film. And this film doesn't have as many of those, for me at least. I think the Balin and Bilbo interaction is great, but it doesn't have as many of those small, tender moments as the first film. I think this film is overall a better film, and I prefer it to the first one. It's better paced. I'd say the direction is even better. And I think it's an excellent film. I think it works better as a whole. As a picture, a full picture, I think it works even better than the first film. But the first film has more individual moments that I like. But I love both of them. I love the first and second. The third, however, is where things go down the drain a little bit. I don't dislike the third film. And we'll talk about that more when I get to it, but it's the weakest Middle-earth film out of all 6, and I'm interested to see what I think of it on this rewatch, because I used to be obsessed with that one, but it just doesn't have as many great elements as the first 2, and kind of the elements that were weakest about the first 2 really get ramped up in the third one, and it's not great. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see when I get to that one. But with all that said, that's about all I have to say about The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug. One of my favorite movies, a great sequel, and easily the best film of the Hobbit trilogy. So that's pretty much all I have to say here in this video. You guys, please let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. Have you seen The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug? Are you going to see it now because of this review? Just whatever your thoughts are, please let me know them all in the comments below. And of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.